How many of you guys have ever asked yourself the question, is the church still relevant today? Or could it possibly be the case that church is becoming more and more obsolete? In today's episode, John and I talk about this, as well as a couple alternatives that may include the internet and even some home churches. I hope you guys enjoy our conversation. So chapter 9 of the book is entitled Church Again, and I think that this is a really important chapter for us to be talking about because throughout the entire book, Francis Chan has been asking a lot of really great and hard questions. I think a good chunk of our videos have ended with, that's a great question, I don't really know. In this chapter, he actually gives a few possible answers, particularly in this framework of what he describes as church B&B. And obviously that's a play on words with the whole Airbnb thing. He talks about how just a few years ago, there was no system outside of like hotels for people to be renting rooms. And yet now, boom, everything is radically changed. Uber has changed the landscape. Amazon has changed so many different things. And he basically asks the question, are we kind of overdue for a revolution in church structure? Not to say that we need to do away with the building that we meet at a certain hour on the weekends, but maybe there's an additional side thing that needs to really be grown up. And he kind of seems to be putting forward house churches as a solid potential answer to that. So I wanted to ask what your thoughts are on this. How do you feel a church B&B model would work?
Yeah, so I really recognized I believe even at one point, he used words that I have used myself, not while describing the reason, not while making the case for church B&B, but for me making the case for YouTube as a viable ministry.
Yes.
This idea of basically, I think at one point he basically said, like, are we essentially Toys R Us and Blockbuster in a world of Amazon and Netflix?
Yeah.
And that's how I have felt about the church for a long, long time, and really Christianity for a long, long time.
Yeah.
In that we are not leveraging the tools of technology in order for ministry and for God's glory.
Yeah.
Now he's more talking about it in terms of actually going backwards in order to go forwards, which is an interesting thought to me. Mm-hmm. But I do think so. My thought then on how he addresses that issue with church B&B, I think a lot of larger churches actually are already trying to do this, not by creating their own individual churches, but through things like small group meetings and things like that. Now, whether those are done effectively with the intention of an actual home church, I'm not really sure. What were your thoughts on?
Well, I definitely see that. I think that there's a lot of churches that are really emphasizing the small group meetings kind of a thing like that. But I think it's an uphill battle in this respect. For better or worse, actually not even better. For worse, we have been preconditioned culturally to expect that church means I do something one day on the weekend. And a lot of churches are trying to push for this thing that's more all-inclusive. It's not just excluded to one day out of the week, but it should influence everything. And I fully agree with that. But I think it's an uphill battle to really get someone to say, hey, I'm also going to do Saturday or Sunday morning. I'm going to be doing Wednesday evening. I'm going to be doing, in the afternoons on Friday. Like, I think that's a tougher sell. And so I like what you were going with as far as like social media ministries and YouTube and things like that. Actually, ironically, I didn't even think about that as I was reading this chapter, which I'm glad you brought up. But I think the real challenge is like, how do we grow on a model that's so dependent on finances to move forward? Like, just to have a campus where your church goes, like where your congregates can go to, it's like thousands and thousands and thousands, if not even millions of dollars to do. I have a hard time seeing Jesus being stoked about how that money is being spent when it could be spent on mission and it could be spent on people instead of a building. Now, of course, I'm not trying to say building is wrong, but maybe there's an imbalance in how those funds are spent.
Yeah, I would agree. I think perhaps at its best, the sort of traditional large building church model is basically to create just a larger version of a home church,
Hmm.
but does it do that effectively?
Yeah.
Maybe at the very outset, but there are so many possible pitfalls.
Yeah. Yeah.
There are so many things, and there's so many distractions, and there's so many things to get caught up in.
It's easy for someone to fall through the cracks in the larger home church model where it's an actual church. When it's a dozen people meeting in a home, you notice when someone's gone. And I think that makes a lot of sense. Something that I did back in the day was a lot of like CrossFit, and a lot of people were saying, "Oh, CrossFit is like a pseudo church community kind of thing," and it really is true. Once you start going to a particular class like regularly, if you don't show up, it is not abnormal for other members of the class to like text you like, "Dude, where were you? We missed you." And you can do that when there's 12 to 15 people, but the moment it's 100 people, people fall through the cracks a lot easier. And I think that this is why we don't have this kind of gang mentality, referencing one of our previous videos. And we don't have the depth of community that I think church really was intended to have.
Yeah, one of my sort of big takeaways from it was when he talks about structure
Mm-hmm.
and how if you look at a church's sort of, doctrinal statement on their website, and then you actually go to that church, do those two things actually line up?
Right.
Do you actually believe and value that everyone has been given their specific gifts with which to serve the body of Christ?
Mm-hmm.
Does that actually happen? Do you believe in people entering into a relationship with one another, and a relationship, whatever it might be? Does that actually happen in practice? And then, like you were saying, what are the obstacles actually that perhaps a larger church has put in the way of themselves in order to achieve those ends, or achieve that type of community, or cultivate it?
So describe for me your ideal church as you understand it now. Obviously, we're all growing, especially in the last the last 48 hours that we've been talking a lot about this. Our ideas are developing and growing. But as it stands presently, describe to me what your ideal church would look like.
I think my ideal, or even harkening back to the very first question from the very first chapter of, if you just had the Bible and you opened it up. Now, part of me would add an addendum to that question.
Mm-hmm.
If you only had a Bible and understood the full cultural context of the world we live in today, because there's a reason that the New Testament church looked the way it did.
Yeah.
It's because it existed within the cultural and socioeconomic time that it did.
That's a really good point.
And so I think we also have to take that into account for ourselves. Because if we don't, that's just foolish. Then we're trying to recreate something that was created specifically for a time 2,000 years ago.
Right.
And so for me, then, I think there's perhaps a hybrid model that exists between what Chan is talking about with this grassroots church B&B thing,
Mm-hmm.
and the more traditional church building. I think there's a hybrid model that exists. And what does that look like in practice is maybe the next question. Well, I think that funnel that we talked about in previous videos, this idea that there are elements of what the church does that are really for those people who are maybe just starting out on their journey. They have a lot of baggage when they walk in the door. They're intimidated. They're scared, whatever it is. And the Sunday service kind of exists for them. It is less hard hitting. It's less about maybe forming them into a full disciple before they walk out, and more just like welcome.
Mm-hmm.
And then as you get into that funnel, then you get into small groups, or maybe it's more like smaller house churches or whatever it is. Then you get into the more formative aspects of what the church could be, and you get into serving and all of these things. Yeah. But to me, I think it's more of a hybrid.
Yeah, I think
what
that.
About you?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that one of the major things that every church needs to answer for itself is, how do they intend to make disciples? Not just like passive consumers of the weekend service, but actually making disciples. And I know that there are churches that are actually out there doing this intentionally, but I also know that there are churches that aren't. Do we have a process of taking someone from just casual interest to actually Ronan's over here trying to say hi. Let me pull Ronan out. There's
Hi,
Ronnie.
Ron.
He's jumping on my lap earlier. Okay, thanks, buddy.
Thanks, Ron.
I know that there are churches that are interested in doing this. Hold on. But maybe aren't doing this intentionally. It's kind of happening as an accidental byproduct. And so if this isn't happening intentionally, I think we have to actually ask ourselves this question. Do we have that funnel? Do we have ways for people to engage outside of the weekend and to go deeper and to actually to do the hard work of discovering God's purpose for your life and all that kind of stuff? One of my favorite blogs and podcasts is run by a guy named Brady Shearer from Pro Church Tools. And his whole mantra is seize the 167. Like there's 168 hours in a week. And yet a lot of churches only tap into one of those hours out of the entire week. So churches should be focused on the other hours as well. How can we deepen people's faith? How can we grow as a church community in that respect? And I think that the key to deepening everyone's experience and to really getting to where God is trying to lead us to is seizing those other hours.
Yeah, absolutely. And the way that I think churches can do that is by implementing so much of these biblical basics that Chan is getting us back to, that he is pointing out. And so, and he makes this very clear all throughout the book. This book does not exist for people to go to their churches and say, see, you're doing it all wrong. You need to close your doors immediately. And I think perhaps the healthy thing to do with this book is to take it and to say, how can we use these biblical elements and biblical practices that Chan has pointed out to help better and deepen the ministry that our church or our churches are doing?
Yeah. So personalizing it, because I think that's really what Chan is hoping that we do. We don't go and take this book to other people, say, you need to do this, but rather take this book, look at the scriptures, apply it to our own lives. What do you feel are some of the takeaways? You're not running a church, so there's only so much you can do to actually change your church. But you are the captain of your own ship. You can decide what you will do in response. So what do you think are the next steps for the Jorgensen family?
So one is changing our mindset around service and serving in the church, and really changing our mindset of when we walk into church, whether it be Sunday, whether it be Wednesday, whether it be Tuesday, whatever it is, we walk in not with a mindset of consuming, but a mindset of giving, giving in and serving in every moment, whatever that means, whatever that looks like. Even if we're not signed up for a ministry that day, even if I'm not going on stage that day, not depending on the staff and the official signed up volunteers of that day to provide me with a really great experience and performance. But rather, how can I use my gifts every single time that I walk in those doors for the health and betterment of that body? I think that's huge. I think that was one of my huge takeaways from this book. And then the other one, and this is very specific to me, is regarding my favorite chapter, chapter 6, talking about good shepherds, talking about leadership, talking what are those characteristics of a godly pastor or shepherd or leader, and holding myself up to those standards and asking myself, am I a praying leader? Am I a biblical leader? All of those things. What about you?
Yeah, for me, I was really struck by some of the obvious commands to the church that Francis Chan was talking about earlier in the book. Helping those in need, helping the outcasts and feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, and those kinds of things. What stands out to me is that that passage where Jesus talks about, many will say unto me, Lord, Lord, didn't I do all these things? And he says, hey, I never knew you. But then the flip side of that story is many people will be like, why am I here? And he says, hey, you took care of me. You clothed me. You fed me. And they're like, when did I do this? He says, when you did it to the least of these, you did it to me. And I think that a large part of what's missing in my life is just that simple, disinterested, compassionate kind of ministry with no expectations. I don't know what that looks like. The cliche is, can I go find a soup kitchen in town that I can volunteer at? And maybe that actually is as simple as what it needs to be. But I want to do something like that. I want to try and incorporate that a little bit more in my own life. And then the second thing is I really am actually enamored by this concept of the home church model, largely because my in-person experience of a local church has still been less than satisfactory, and I'm drawn to the intimacy that a church B&B model seems to offer. And so maybe the second step is to creating some kind of small group in my home that I can invite people to. I actually put a post out on my YouTube community page, like, hey, is anyone in Portland? Because it'd be super cool to do like a small group meeting with all the YouTube peoples out there. And I don't know. Yeah. I don't know if that's a possibility yet, but I don't know. I'm really kind of interested in that model.
Yeah, but I think the important thing for anyone who reads this book and also does what the book asks us to do, which is go back to scripture and weigh everything that this book has said against that, is to, as Chan sort of begins with, be doers of these words.
Yes.
And these commands rather than just hearers of it. Don't let this be another Christian book that I read and I learned a few things and I had a conversation. But actually, my prayer is that my life would look very, very different 6 months from now.
Yes.
In how I engage with the church and how I serve in the church because of reading this book and being challenged by these thoughts.
Yeah, that's such a good point. It's so easy, especially when you and I are kind of in this space of consistently consuming content to share with other people, for it to only be that. But I think you're absolutely right. We got to be intentional about actually living out what God is teaching us and convicting us of. That can be uncomfortable. That can be difficult, sometimes confusing, but ultimately that's the call. And I think
so we'll do the 6 month. We'll do the 6 month update video and we'll each get a grade.
There you go.
That's what it's all about, really.
Yeah. As you guys know, we have one more video in this series. Go ahead and click or tap right over here to go to John's channel and see that last video in this series. But before you do that, do me a favor. Is there another book, another author, another subject that you'd like to see John and I do a little bit more of an extended conversation around? Let me know in the comment section below.